The long decline. Every great age has its twilight. The Viking Age did not end with a single event. There was no battle of final Viking things, no definitive date when the Norse world closed its longships and retired from history. Instead, it faded gradually, over the course of the 11th century and into the 12th, as the conditions that had made Viking expansion possible changed, and as the Norse world itself was transformed by the very forces it had helped to set in motion. Understanding why the Viking Age ended requires understanding what had sustained it. The age had been built on a combination of factors: the technological superiority of the longship, the relative weakness and disunity of the peoples being raided, the existence of wealthy but poorly defended targets, the cultural and social pressures within Scandinavian society that drove young men to seek fortune abroad, and the pagan religious framework that celebrated martial glory and death in battle. By the early 11th century, each of these foundations was eroding. The peoples of England, Ireland, and France had learned from their experiences. They built coastal defenses, established early warning systems, created more professional armies, and fortified their towns. The element of surprise, so crucial to the classic Viking raid, became harder and harder to achieve. A monastery that had once sat undefended on a headland was now likely to have stone walls and a warning network. The conversion to Christianity removed the distinctive religious motivation for Viking raiding. A Christian Norse warrior could no longer seek glory by killing monks, quite the opposite. The Church actively discouraged violence against other Christians and channeled martial energy in new directions, most notably the Crusades. By the late 11th century, Norsemen who sought adventure and glory through military action were as likely to be found crusading in the Holy Land as raiding in England. The political consolidation of Scandinavia also played a role. As the Norse kingdoms grew stronger and more centralized, the power of individual jarls and chieftains to organize independent expeditions diminished. Kings increasingly sought to monopolize military force, and the anarchic energy of the early Viking Age was channeled into more controlled forms of royal warfare and diplomacy. The Battle of Stamford Bridge and the end of an era. If any single date can serve as the symbolic end of the Viking Age, it is September 25th, 1066, the date of the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, England. The battle was the climax of the last great Viking invasion of England. The invader was Harald Hardrada, Harald Sigurdsson, King of Norway, who brought a fleet estimated at 300 ships and an army of perhaps 9,000 warriors to assert his claim to the English throne. Harald had a plausible genealogical claim to England, and he was arguably the most formidable military commander in the Norse world, a man who had served in the Varangian Guard, fought across the Byzantine Empire, and accumulated decades of experience in warfare. Harald was allied with Tostig Godwinson, the disgruntled brother of the English king Harald Godwinson. Together they won a significant early victory at the Battle of Fulford Gate, defeating the northern English earls who had marched to oppose them. They then awaited the English army at the village of Stamford Bridge, east of York. What happened next was a masterpiece of rapid strategic movement by the English king Harold, receiving news of the Norse invasion while in the south, preparing for another invasion, that of William of Normandy. Harold force-marched his army north, covering nearly 300 kilometers in about 4 days. He caught the Norse army by surprise at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The battle was fierce but decisive. Harald Hardrada was killed, reportedly by an arrow through the throat. Tostig was also killed. Of the 300 ships that had brought the invaders to England, fewer than 20 were needed to carry the survivors home. Stamford Bridge was not just the end of Harald Hardrada. It was the end of a tradition. No large-scale Norse invasion of a major European power would follow. The age of conquest and large-scale migration that had characterized the previous 2 centuries was over. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed in the south, and William, though himself the descendant of Norse settlers, represented something entirely different: the feudal Christian Europe that the Vikings had helped to create but no longer stood apart from. The Battle of Clontarf and the end of Norse Ireland. If Stamford Bridge marked the end of Norse ambitions in England, an earlier battle had marked the beginning of the end of Norse dominance in Ireland. The Battle of Clontarf, fought on Good Friday, April 23rd, 1014, near Dublin, was one of the most significant battles in Irish history, though its significance has been simplified and mythologized in ways that obscure the complex reality. The battle is usually presented as the great Irish High King Brian Boru defeating the Vikings and ending Norse power in Ireland. The reality was more complicated. Brian Boru was indeed a remarkable leader who had unified much of Ireland under his authority, an achievement no Irish king had managed before. But the Battle of Clontarf was not simply Irish versus Norse. It was a civil war within Irish politics, with some Norse forces fighting on both sides, and some Irish forces fighting against Brian. Brian Boru won the battle, but died in the fighting, killed in his tent by fleeing Norse warriors. His victory ended the ambitions of the Leinster provincial king, who had challenged his authority, and it significantly reduced the military power of the Dublin Norse. But it did not expel the Norse from Ireland. The Norse of Dublin remained in the city for another century and more, deeply integrated into Irish political and commercial life. They converted to Christianity, intermarried with Irish families, and became in many ways simply another component of the complex Irish political landscape. The real end of Norse Ireland came not with Clontarf, but with the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169 to 1171, which swept away both the remaining Norse urban aristocracy and the native Irish power structures, replacing them with a new colonial order. Greenland and the end of the Western settlement. The story of the Norse Greenlandic colonies is one of the most poignant in Viking history, a tale of endurance, isolation, and eventual extinction. The colonies that Eric the Red had established around 985 survived for nearly 400 years, far longer than most people realize. But they were always vulnerable, and eventually the combination of environmental change, economic decline, and isolation proved fatal. The Norse Greenlanders faced a deteriorating climate from the 12th century onward. The medieval warm period that had made the colonization possible was gradually giving way to the Little Ice Age, which brought colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and expanding sea ice that made voyages from Norway increasingly difficult and dangerous. The walrus ivory trade, which had sustained Greenlandic commerce, was undermined in the 13th and 14th centuries by the arrival of African elephant ivory in European markets, carried by Portuguese and Italian traders who had established contact with sub-Saharan Africa. As ivory prices fell, the economic rationale for maintaining the distant Greenlandic colonies weakened. The Western settlement, the smaller and more northerly of the two colonies, apparently collapsed in the mid-14th century. When a Norwegian clergyman visited around 1350, he found only empty farms and some feral cattle. The eastern settlement held on longer, perhaps until the early 15th century. The last recorded ship from Greenland arrived in Iceland in 1410. After that, silence. European civilization would not return to Greenland for nearly 300 years. Why did the colonists die out rather than leaving? This is a question that has fascinated scholars for generations. The evidence suggests that the Norse Greenlanders clung to their European farming lifestyle and social identity, even as conditions made it increasingly unsuitable. Archaeological evidence shows that they continued to raise cattle and grain long after the climate had made these activities marginal, while largely refusing to adopt the seal hunting and kayak technology of the Inuit who lived nearby. Whether this was cultural rigidity, class snobbery, or simply the difficulty of abandoning an entire way of life in a society with no mechanism for collective adaptation, it contributed to their ultimate extinction. The fate of the Greenlandic Norse is a haunting reminder that even resilient, adaptive civilizations can fail when the combination of external pressures and internal limitations becomes too great. The Norse in Russia, the Varangian legacy. The eastern branch of the Norse diaspora left a legacy of profound and lasting significance in Russia and Eastern Europe. The Norse Varangians had established the framework of what would become the first Russian state, Kievan Rus, and their influence shaped the development of Russian political culture, law, and commerce for generations. The Rurikid dynasty, descended from the semi-legendary Norse chieftain Rurik, ruled Russia for 7 centuries until 1598, long after the Varangians had been absorbed into the Slavic population around them. The dynasty that claimed Norse origins continued to legitimize its power through that connection. The Norse character of the ruling class faded quickly. By the mid-10th century, the princes of Kiev bore Slavic names and spoke Slavic languages, but the institutional and cultural imprint remained. The conversion of Kievan Rus to Christianity in 988 under Prince Vladimir I was one of the most consequential events in Russian history. Vladimir, faced with a choice among Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, chose Byzantine Christianity, according to legend, partly because his envoys reported that the liturgy in the Hagia Sophia was so beautiful they could not tell whether they were on earth or in heaven. The adoption of Byzantine Christianity brought Russia into a different cultural sphere from the Catholic West and shaped Russian culture, art, and political thought for a millennium. The great churches of Kiev, with their Byzantine-influenced mosaics and icons, are a direct product of the Norse settlement that had preceded the conversion by 100 years. The word Russia itself likely derives from the Norse via the Finnish word rotsi, used to describe the Norse traders and settlers, a word that in turn probably derives from a Norse term for rowing or rowing men. The country's very name is a Viking inheritance. Archaeology and what the ground tells us. Our understanding of the Viking Age has been transformed over the past century by archaeology. Before systematic excavation, the Norse were known primarily through their victims' accounts, which naturally emphasized their violence, and through their own literary tradition, which was composed centuries after the events it described and filtered through Christian and literary conventions that inevitably distorted the historical record. Archaeology gives us something different, direct physical evidence of how the Norse lived, what they made, what they ate, how they buried their dead, and how they organized their communities. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in Norway in 1904, is one of the most spectacular archaeological finds in European history. The burial mound contained a beautifully preserved longship, the skeleton of a high-status woman, possibly a queen or priestess, and a remarkable collection of grave goods, including carved wooden furniture, textiles, a cart, sleighs, and numerous personal objects. The quality of the carving on the wooden objects, intricate, swirling animal forms of extraordinary sophistication, shattered the assumption that the Norse were mere barbarians. The Oseberg find revealed a culture with a highly developed artistic tradition and a complex understanding of symbolism and design. Excavations at sites like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin have revealed the daily realities of Norse urban life. The houses were typically rectangular timber structures with walls of wattle and daub or horizontal planks, a central hearth for heating and cooking, and benches along the walls for sleeping. Norse families lived in close proximity to their animals, especially during winter, when the shared body heat was essential. The settlements were densely packed, with workshops, markets, and living quarters intermixed. The archaeological evidence of craft production, leatherworking, smithing, textile production, comb making from antler and bone, reveals a sophisticated urban economy. DNA analysis is adding another dimension to our understanding. Modern genetics can trace the movement of Norse populations across the Viking world. Studies of ancient DNA from burial sites have confirmed that the Norse were genuinely mobile, that individuals buried in England or Ireland or Russia were indeed of Scandinavian genetic origin, not just local people who adopted Norse culture. They have also confirmed the genetic diversity of Norse communities, with evidence of significant contributions from British and Irish and Slavic populations as the Norse intermarried with local people wherever they settled. The discovery of Norse genetic heritage in populations far beyond Scandinavia is one of the most striking findings of recent research. Studies of populations in the British Isles, Iceland, Russia, and even as far afield as Newfoundland and the islands of the North Atlantic have found genetic signatures that can be traced to Scandinavian ancestors. The Norse did not merely raid and trade, they left a genetic legacy that persists to this day. The literary legacy, sagas and Eddas. Among the most important legacies of the Viking Age is its literature. The Norse literary tradition produced some of the most remarkable works of medieval writing, preserved almost entirely by Icelandic scholars and scribes of the 12th and 13th centuries, who recognized the value of what they were recording. The prose Edda, written by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson around 1220, is our primary source for Norse mythology. Snorri was a remarkable figure, a politician, historian, and literary critic, as well as a mythologist, who wrote his account of the Norse gods, partly as a handbook for aspiring poets who needed to understand the mythological references in traditional skaldic poetry. The prose Edda gives us the stories of Odin, Thor, Loki, and the other Norse gods in their most complete form. Without Snorri, much of Norse mythology would have been lost entirely. The poetic Edda, a collection of mythological and heroic poems of uncertain authorship, preserved in a manuscript from around 1270, contains some of the most powerful poetry in any medieval language. The Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, is a profound meditation on the creation and ultimate destruction of the world, told from the perspective of a prophetess raised from the dead by Odin. Its vision of Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, combines cosmic drama with human tragedy in a way that has inspired artists and writers down to our own time. The family sagas, composed in Iceland between roughly 1200 and 1350, though describing events of the 9th through 11th centuries, are perhaps the greatest achievement of Norse literature. These long prose narratives describe the lives of Icelandic farming families during the Viking Age, combining history, fiction, psychology, and social observation in a form that looks, in many ways, surprisingly modern. The best of them, Njal's saga, Egil's saga, Laxdæla saga, Grettis saga, are works of genuine literary genius, rich in complex characters, moral ambiguity, and narrative sophistication. They were composed at the very end of the Viking Age, when the society they described had already changed beyond recognition, but they preserve a vision of the Norse world that has shaped how all subsequent generations have understood the Vikings. The sagas are not simple heroic narratives. They are full of moral complexity, characters who are simultaneously admirable and flawed, situations where right and wrong are genuinely difficult to distinguish, and tragedies that arise not from villainy, but from the collision of legitimate but incompatible values. They grapple seriously with questions of honor, loyalty, justice, and the limits of human agency that are just as relevant today as they were in the Viking Age. The Viking heritage in language and law. The practical legacy of the Vikings is written into the very fabric of modern civilization in ways that are often invisible because they have become so familiar. The English language is one of the most direct examples. Old Norse influenced English at a fundamental level, not just in loanwords, but in grammatical structures and core vocabulary. The pronouns they, them, and their are Old Norse. In Old English, the third-person plural pronouns began with h. Dozens of everyday words: sky, window, knife, husband, cake, anger, die, ugly, get, give, take, call, want, seen, are of Old Norse origin. The influence was so pervasive because in the Danelaw, Norse and English speakers lived in close contact for generations, creating a mixed vernacular that was absorbed into the developing English language. The legal traditions of Scandinavia contributed to the development of law in ways that are still visible. The Thing system, the Norse assembly where free men gathered to make law and settle disputes, is the ancestor of the parliaments and assemblies that developed throughout Northern Europe. The Icelandic Althing, still functioning today as the Parliament of Iceland, is the oldest continuous parliament in the world. the democratic principle that free men should have a say in the laws that governed them, which was foundational to Norse society, fed into the developing tradition of limited government and representative institutions in Northern Europe. In Iceland, the Norse literary and legal tradition was preserved with particular care. Icelandic scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries recognized that they were the custodians of a unique cultural heritage, the myths, poetry, and historical records of the Norse world, and they devoted themselves to writing it down. Without the Icelandic literary tradition, our knowledge of Norse mythology would be thin and fragmentary. The Icelanders were the archivists of the Viking Age. The Viking world in modern imagination. The Vikings have never really left us. Since the 19th century, they have been a constant presence in Western popular culture, serving as figures onto which successive generations have projected their own fantasies, anxieties, and aspirations. The Romantic movement of the 19th century rediscovered the Norse world with enthusiasm, seeing in it a vision of noble, freedom-loving Germanic peoples uncorrupted by Roman decadence or Christian superstition. Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, based on Norse and Germanic mythology, is the most famous product of this enthusiasm, a work that takes the Eddic tradition and transforms it into something vast and operatic. The image of the horned helmet, actually not worn by Viking warriors in battle, but by Norse priests in religious ceremonies, became iconic during this period and has never quite gone away. The 20th century added new dimensions to the Viking image. The comics character Thor, created by Marvel Comics in 1962, drew on Norse mythology to create one of the most popular superhero franchises in the world. The television series Vikings and the Marvel films have brought Norse culture to enormous global audiences, though with liberties taken that would make a medieval Norse person blink. The fantasy tradition, from Tolkien onwards, draws heavily on Norse mythology. Middle-earth's languages, cosmology, and mythology are saturated with Norse influences. Some of this popular engagement with the Viking world is superficial or distorted, but some of it reflects a genuine fascination with what the Norse world actually was, a culture of extraordinary energy and creativity, produced in harsh conditions that shaped the world we live in more profoundly than most people realize. The growing neo-pagan movement known as Asatru, the Norse faith, represents a more serious engagement with Norse religion. Practitioners of Asatru seek to revive the worship of the Norse gods as a living spiritual practice, adapted to modern life. While the historical accuracy of their reconstructions can be questioned, they represent a genuine attempt to engage with the Norse spiritual tradition on its own terms. The real Viking reckoning. Any honest reckoning with the Viking Age must confront its darkest aspects. The Norse were brilliant, creative, and in many ways admirable. They were also slavers, and this fact deserves to be stated plainly and without equivocation. The slave trade was not a peripheral activity in Viking society. It was central. Raids were conducted specifically to capture enslaved people for sale. The thrall, the Norse word for an enslaved person, was the foundation of Norse agricultural and domestic labor. The slave markets of Dublin, Hedeby, and the Volga trading cities were major commercial institutions. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of men, women, and children were captured in raids on Ireland, England, Scotland, France, and the Slavic lands, and sold into a life of servitude. The Norse did not invent slavery. It was endemic throughout the ancient and medieval world, but they were among the most active practitioners of the slave trade in early medieval Europe. And the scale of their slaving activities had real consequences for the communities they raided. Irish archaeological evidence shows significant demographic disruption in coastal communities during the height of Viking raiding, partly attributable to the removal of population through enslavement. The violence of Viking raiding was real and should not be romanticized. The destruction of monasteries was not just the loss of religious buildings, it was the destruction of libraries, schools, and centers of learning that had taken generations to build. The communities that were raided suffered genuine trauma, and the fear of Norse attacks shaped European culture for generations. At the same time, a complete picture of the Viking Age must also acknowledge the creative, commercial, and exploratory dimensions of Norse civilization. The Norse were not just destroyers, they were builders. The towns they founded, Dublin, York, Kiev, became lasting centers of civilization. The trade networks they created connected economies across thousands of kilometers. The literature they produced is among the finest of the medieval world. The political institutions they developed, the Thing, the Althing, the common law traditions of the Danelaw, contributed to the development of democratic governance in Northern Europe. The Viking Age was, in the end, a period of extraordinary human energy, violent, creative, sometimes admirable, sometimes appalling, and always fascinating. It reshaped the map of Europe, connected distant economies, and left cultural legacies that persist to this day. Understanding it honestly means holding both the darkness and the brilliance in view simultaneously. The last Vikings. The Viking Age did not end cleanly. Individual Norse warriors and traders continued to operate in the old patterns well into the 12th century. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople accepted Norse recruits until the mid-12th century. Norse pirates raided sporadically along European coasts for generations after Stamford Bridge. The Norse colonies in Greenland survived until the 15th century, but the culture that had produced the great age of raids and exploration was gone. Scandinavia had been absorbed into Christian Europe with all that implied: Latin literacy, papal politics, feudal structures, crusading ideology. The longship still sailed, but its sailors were now Christian knights as often as pagan warriors. The Thing still met, but its decisions were increasingly constrained by royal authority and canonical law. The skalds still composed, but the poetry was changing. The Norse contribution to world history was substantial and multifaceted. They had populated the North Atlantic, from Iceland to Greenland to North America. They had connected the trade networks of Northern and Eastern Europe. They had founded kingdoms and cities from Dublin to Kyiv. They had contributed to the development of the English, Russian, and Irish languages. They had created a literary tradition of enduring power. And they had demonstrated, at a crucial period in European history, the possibilities of oceanic navigation, that the sea was not a barrier, but a highway, connecting rather than dividing the human world. When Norse sailors stood on the shores of Newfoundland around the year 1000, looking out at a land no European had seen before, they were at the furthest reach of a civilization that had started on the fjords of Norway and the farms of Denmark. That achievement, reaching out across the ocean into the unknown, is the Viking story at its most human and most enduring. It is the story of a people who refused to stay put, who found in the sea not a limit but an invitation, and who followed that invitation to the edges of the world they knew. The ships are gone. The longhouses have rotted into the earth. The gods have been replaced by other gods, but the Norse world persists, in the languages we speak, in the laws we live under, in the stories we tell, and in the genetic inheritance of millions of people who carry, in their DNA, the traces of those remarkable, restless, extraordinary people who once set out from Scandinavia and changed the world.